The courtroom was packed. A stern judge, confined to a wheelchair, was poised to condemn a poor father for a crime he swore he did not commit. It was then that the accused's daughter, a 7-year-old girl, stood up, walked to the judge, and said with a firm voice, "Release my father, and I will make you walk." The courtroom erupted in laughter until something extraordinary happened, and the laughter died into silence. To understand how this incredible moment came to be, we must go back only a few minutes. The air in the courtroom was dense, almost unbreathable, heavy with the weight of countless verdicts and sealed fates. The walls, paneled in dark wood and lined with shelves overflowing with books whose gilded spines no longer shone, seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the high windows. At the center of it all, elevated above the others like a monarch on his ebony throne, sat Judge Mateo Vargas. His face was a mask of severity, every wrinkle carved by years of implacable decisions, and a bitterness that had taken root in his soul long before the car accident confined him to that wheelchair. 15 years ago, the screech of tires and the shriek of twisting metal had silenced not only his legs, but also any trace of compassion he might have once held. Since then, Judge Vargas had become a legend, a symbol of cold, blind justice, a man for whom emotion was an inadmissible weakness in the sacred halls of the law. Novice lawyers trembled when presenting their cases before him, and the accused knew their pleas for mercy would shatter against a wall of indifference. That morning, his steel-like gaze was fixed on the man seated before him, a man whose life hung by a thread. Facing the imposing bench, hands cuffed in his lap, was Javier Mendoza. He was not a hardened criminal, but an ordinary man, a single father whose face was etched with exhaustion and despair. His restless, sunken eyes darted around the room, searching for a sliver of hope in a place that offered none. He was a construction worker, with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, accused of an armed robbery at a local pharmacy. The evidence against him was, on the surface, overwhelming. There was a grainy security video showing a man of his build, an eyewitness who had identified him in a lineup, and cell phone records placing him near the scene of the crime. Yet, despite the mountain of evidence, the truth in Javier's eyes told another story. They pleaded not for pity, but for real justice. A justice that cold documents and blurry images could not reveal. Seated in the first row, barely visible behind the wooden railing, was his daughter, Sofía. At only 7 years old, she watched everything with a stillness unbefitting her age, her small chin resting on her hands. Her faded floral dress and worn-out sneakers told a story of hardship the court refused to hear. Judge Vargas reviewed the final documents with an almost surgical meticulousness. Each movement of his hands was precise and deliberate, as if he were dissecting the accused's last vestiges of hope. The sound of his pen tapping rhythmically against the wooden desk echoed in the tense silence, a metronome counting down to condemnation. The room was crowded, reporters with notebooks ready to capture the drama, relatives of the assaulted pharmacist who shot hateful glances at Javier, and indifferent court officials who had seen this scene hundreds of times. Mateo looked up. His cold eyes swept across the room, before settling once again on Javier. His voice, deep and without inflection, broke the silence. "Before I proceed, With the reading of the final verdict, he said slowly, drawing out the words for added weight. Does anyone present wish to add anything they consider of vital relevance to this case? It was a formality, a rhetorical question that rarely received an answer. The silence deepened, a heavy blanket suffocating everyone present. No hand was raised, no voice dared to interrupt. The ritual was complete. Javier Mendoza's fate seemed sealed, his future reduced to a prison cell. But then, when all hope had turned to ash, something unexpected happened. Like a small flame igniting in the deepest darkness, a thin but incredibly clear and determined voice echoed in the cathedral of silence. I want to say something. Every head turned in unison, as if pulled by a single string. A murmur of surprise and confusion rippled through the room. There, standing in the first row, was little Sofía. She had stepped out from the bench where she had sat motionless for hours, and now, with a determination that defied her fragile frame, she was walking toward the center of the court. Her steps were short but firm, each one an act of defiance against the room's imposing authority. Judge Vargas frowned, a mixture of irritation and intrigue crossing his impassive face. A bailiff moved to intercept her, to return her to her seat and restore order. But a slight gesture from the judge's hand stopped him in his tracks. Sofía stopped directly in front of the bench, lifted her small head, and looked straight into the eyes of the man who held her father's future in his hands. I am Sofía Mendoza, Javier's daughter, she said, her voice trembling slightly but never breaking. And I have something important to say before you make a terrible mistake. The girl's audacity left the room in a state of collective shock. The murmurs grew into audible whispers. Reporters leaned forward, their pens flying across paper, sensing a story far more compelling than a simple robbery. Judge Vargas watched the child, his eyes narrowed as if trying to decipher a puzzle. He saw her not as a child, but as an interruption, an anomaly in his ordered and predictable universe. His eyes, accustomed to disarming the most seasoned lawyers, bore into her with a cutting coldness, expecting her to cower, to retreat from his power. But Sofía did not move. She stood her ground, a small soldier defending her last fortress. You have 2 minutes, child, the judge granted, his voice dripping with impatience and condescension. And I advise you to know very well what you are doing, because this court's patience has a very clear limit. The warning hung in the air, a veiled threat. But Sofía seemed unfazed. She took a deep breath, a tiny movement of her chest that was almost imperceptible, and clenched her fists at her sides, anchoring herself in her purpose. Sir, Sofía began, her voice now firmer, resonating with a conviction that seemed impossible for someone her size. You are about to send my father to prison for something he didn't do. She paused, letting her words sink into the tense atmosphere before delivering her incredible proposal. But if you release him, if you trust me that he is innocent, I will make you walk again. If the room had been silent before, it now seemed to exist in an absolute vacuum. Time itself felt suspended. For a moment, no one knew how to react. Then, disbelief gave way to mockery. A ripple of snickers was followed immediately by a wave of laughter that filled the courtroom. A lawyer in the back covered his mouth to stifle a guffaw. A journalist smirked with cynicism. The idea was so absurd, so fantastical, that it shattered the solemnity of the place. But Judge Vargas did not laugh. His face, if possible, hardened even more. He clenched his jaw so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. This was not just an interruption. It was an insult to his intelligence, to his suffering. That is blackmail, Judge Vargas snapped, his voice like the crack of a whip. The contempt in his tone was so palpable it made some of the laughers fall silent immediately. He leaned forward in his wheelchair, his body tense with rage. Crude and desperate emotional blackmail from the mouth of a child who understands neither the gravity of this place nor the seriousness of its proceedings. The accusation was brutal, designed to crush the girl and end this farce once and for all. Anyone else would have crumbled under the weight of those words, but Sofía held his gaze, her large, serious eyes acting as a shield against his anger. "It's not blackmail, Your Honor," she replied, her voice quiet but unshakable. "It's a promise." The simplicity and sincerity of her answer momentarily disarmed the judge. He had expected tears, expected her to run away, but instead, he was met with a defiant calm he did not know how to process. It was like trying to knock down a steel wall with his bare hands. Judge Vargas leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control of the situation and his own emotions. The heat of fury rose up his neck, a sensation he detested because it was a reminder of his lack of control. "Listen to me very carefully, child," he said, adopting a falsely paternalistic tone that was more menacing than his anger. "This is a court of justice. I am not guided by promises or emotions. I follow the law, and the law is based on evidence, on tangible facts, on verifiable proof." He gestured toward the pile of documents on his desk. "And the evidence says your father is guilty. What you are suggesting is not just impossible. It is foolishness, a childish fantasy." He paused, then added with deliberate cruelty, "My paralysis, for your information, is medically irreversible. For 15 years, I have listened to the world's best specialists tell me there is nothing to be done. This trial is not the place for your little girl's tricks or your made-up miracles. So, go back to your seat and let the adults finish this." The room held its breath, expecting the girl to finally surrender to the judge's crushing logic and coldness. But Sofía took another step toward the bench, shortening the distance between her fragility and his immovable power. "But you're not just here to follow what the papers say, are you?" she countered, with a logic and firmness that surprised everyone once more. Her question was not a plea, but a challenge aimed directly at the judge's conception of his own role. "You're here to do what is right, and sometimes what is right isn't written in reports or seen in blurry photos. Sometimes what is right is felt here." As she said this, she brought a small hand to her heart, a gesture so simple and pure, it contrasted violently with the cynical atmosphere of the court. For the first time in a long time, someone was not speaking to the judge, but to the man. Someone was appealing to a part of him he believed was dead and buried under layers of pain and resentment. Sophia's response had subtly shifted the dynamic, transforming her offer from a desperate trick into a fundamental question about the nature of justice. Judge Vargas felt a pang of irritation so sharp it almost made him lose his composure. He gripped the armrests of his chair with tremendous force, his knuckles turning white. The worn leather creaked under his fingers. Who did this child think she was to lecture him on justice? He who had dedicated his entire life to the law, who had sacrificed everything for it. What is right is in the law, and the law demands proof, facts, structure, he growled, his voice vibrating with contained fury. Not emotional tricks, not sideshow miracles. His gaze drifted for a moment to his own legs, motionless and alien beneath his black robe. The phantom pain, a constant echo of his former life, seemed to intensify. He hated that she had touched that nerve, that she had turned his personal tragedy into a part of this circus. He wanted to end it, to slam his gavel and sentence Javier Mendoza to oblivion. But something in the girl's unwavering gaze stopped him. It was a look that did not judge, that did not pity, but that seemed to see through his armor, directly to the imprisoned man within. Then let me prove it to you, Sofía insisted, her voice now a whisper that nonetheless carried across the entire room. I'm not asking you to overturn the trial. I'm not asking you to release my father yet. I'm only asking for a small test. Give me just 1 minute, right here, right now. Let me show you. Not everything, just a little. Enough for you to understand that what I say is true. Enough for you to see that you can choose real justice, not the justice of papers. The proposal was clever, almost Machiavellian in its simplicity. She was not asking the judge to compromise his verdict, only to open a tiny crack in his skepticism. The entire room was filled with a palpable expectation, a tension so thick you could feel it on your skin, as if lightning were about to strike inside the building. The reporters had stopped writing and were now watching, motionless. The lawyers, the prosecutor, even the guards, all of them stared at Judge Vargas, awaiting his decision. The fate of the hearing, and perhaps much more, hung on his answer. Judge Mateo Vargas found himself trapped in an impossible dilemma. His logical, trained mind screamed that this was monumental foolishness. This is a court, not a theater stage, he thought, feeling a wave of annoyance. To allow this spectacle would set a terrible precedent. It would turn his courtroom into a circus, undermining his authority for life. He would be the laughingstock of the entire legal community. He could already picture the next day's headlines, the smirks of his colleagues. And yet, something in the girl's words, just enough, he had to admit, had stopped him from shutting her down immediately. There was a part of him, a part he loathed to acknowledge, that was gnawed by curiosity. And beneath the curiosity, in the deepest recess of his being, was a desperate yearning, a desire as ancient and painful as his own paralysis. Yes, the question was poison, a seed of irrational hope that threatened to shatter the order he had so painstakingly built. Skepticism warred with desperation on the battlefield of his soul. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Each second was a drop of lead falling into a bottomless well. From the defendant's box, Javier Mendoza watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. He wanted to scream for her to stop, to not expose herself to more humiliation for his sake, but the words caught in his throat. He was paralyzed by helplessness, a mere spectator in the drama his own daughter had unleashed. Judge Vargas finally tore his gaze from Sofia and looked down at his own hands, resting inert on his lap. He remembered the feel of grass beneath his feet, the simple joy of running, the mundane normality of walking down a hallway, memories that had faded, as if they belonged to someone else. The anger he felt toward the child began to morph into something more complex, an anger at his own fate, at the injustice of his condition. Perhaps it was that rage, or perhaps it was the pure, audacious faith in the girl's eyes that finally tipped the scales. Without a word, Judge Vargas gave an almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a clear yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a silent capitulation, a tacit permission that hung in the air like a suspended sentence. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale as one. Sophia understood. With a solemnity that chilled the blood, she slowly walked the final few steps that separated her from the bench. The fabric of her dress whispered against the marble floor, the only sound in a world that had fallen silent. She stopped directly in front of the imposing wheelchair, a tiny David before a Goliath of wood and steel. And then, with a grace and reverence no one expected, she knelt. The contact of her small knees on the cold marble echoed like a dull thud. The gesture, an act of submission, and yet of power, captured everyone's attention in a way her words had not. She wasn't challenging the judge, she was praying for him. The dynamic had shifted completely once more. Kneeling before the wheelchair, Sophia raised her trembling hands and, with infinite delicacy, placed them on the judge's motionless knees. The contact of her warm, soft skin through the thick fabric of his trousers was like a small electric shock. For Judge Vargas, it was an act of such strange and overwhelming intimacy that he had to fight the urge to push her away. It had been years since anyone had touched him that way, with that mix of reverence and hope, without the clinical distance of a doctor or the clumsy pity of an acquaintance. The girl's palms trembled slightly, but her expression was one of absolute concentration. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if to block out the world and focus all her energy on a single point. She took another deep breath and began to murmur. They were not recognizable words, not a prayer learned from a catechism book. It was a soft babble, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to spring directly from her heart, unfiltered and unadorned. It was a pure language, heavy with raw, sincere feeling, faith in its most elemental form. The sounds that left Sophia's lips were like a stream flowing over stones, a sweet and constant melody that seemed to have the power to pierce the thick, invisible armor Judge Vargas had built around himself. He kept his eyes hard, his jaw clenched, trying with all his might to dismiss the childish gesture, to label it as just another manipulation. It was a farce, he told himself, a performance for an imaginary jury. But despite his resistance, the girl's whispers seemed to seep through the cracks in his armor, reaching places he had kept under lock and key for 15 years. The girl squeezed her eyes shut tighter, her small face contorted in a look of supreme effort, as if she were battling an invisible force, lifting an enormous weight with her will alone. She whispered with unwavering faith, her fingers pressing lightly against the judge's skin, her knees still grounded on the icy marble, an anchor of humility in the tempest of emotion sweeping the room. For a moment, no one dared to break the spell. The courtroom's skepticism, had been replaced by a strange fascination, a morbid curiosity to see how this incredible spectacle would end. Even the most cynical reporters had lowered their notebooks, but the silence was too fragile to last. A sarcastic cough, deliberately loud, shattered the atmosphere from the back of the room. "Come on, little miracle worker. Let's see if you can make him dance flamenco." A man jeered in a rough voice, drawing the first nervous laughs. The cruel joke broke the tension, and like a cracking dam, disbelief gave way to open mockery. The laughter grew louder, crueler, feeding on itself. "Maybe she needs to concentrate harder," shouted another. "Or a donation for the cause," a third added. Sophia remained motionless, as if in a world of her own where the taunts could not reach her, but a slight tremor in her shoulders betrayed the impact of their cruelty. Judge Vargas felt a surge of rage, but this time it was not directed at the girl. It was a cold, sharp fury aimed at the crowd, at this pack of hyenas laughing at a child's faith and, by extension, at his own tragedy. He wanted to slam his gavel with all his might, to scream at them to be silent, to impose order with the tyranny they all expected of him. Inwardly, he wanted to end it, to protect the girl from further humiliation, and to protect himself from the false hope that threatened to poison him. But something in him hesitated. An ancient part of himself, the part that remembered what it was like to believe in something greater than law and logic, desperately wished she was right. He longed, with an intensity that frightened him, to feel something, anything, in those dead limbs. And so he remained silent, his face a mask of stone, his soul a battlefield where cynicism and a forbidden desire fought to the death. He had become, unwillingly, the silent protector of her small ritual. The 2 minutes passed, an eternity measured in whispers and stifled laughter. Sophia's murmuring ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Still kneeling, the girl slowly lifted her face and looked at him. Her large, moist eyes were filled with a hope so pure and vulnerable that the judge found it almost painful to meet them. They searched his face for any sign, a twitch, a gesture, the slightest confirmation that her effort had not been in vain. Her gaze was a silent question that exposed him, that stripped him bare before the entire room. All eyes were now fixed on him, awaiting his reaction, his verdict on the supposed miracle. The power was once again in his hands. He could crush that hope with a single word or feed it with a lie. The pressure was immense, and Mateo Vargas did the only thing he knew how to do. He retreated into his shell of cynicism and contempt. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Vargas raised an eyebrow. It was a small gesture, but it was loaded with infinite disdain. And then he chuckled. It was not a laugh, but a dry, short, bitter sound, a rusty noise that seemed to rise from the depths of his disappointment. "Is that all?" he said, his voice dripping with a contempt more cruel than any shout. "A touching performance, I admit, but utterly useless." He looked Sophia directly in the eye, without mercy. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, child, but as expected, absolutely nothing has happened. My legs are as dead as they were 5 minutes ago." His chuckle, though brief, was the signal the crowd had been waiting for. It was the door swinging open to their own cruelty. The courtroom, released from the strange tension, erupted in loud, unrestrained laughter, a chorus of mockery that crashed down upon Sophia's small frame. "The miracle has expired!" a young man shouted from the back. A woman whispered to her neighbor, just loud enough to be heard, "Poor thing, she's going to be traumatized for life." The sound of the laughter was like a physical slap to Javier Mendoza. He writhed in the defendant's box, impotence and rage warring within him. He tried to stand, to scream at them all to stop, to leave his daughter alone, but he was immediately forced back down by the guard at his side, whose hand pressed hard on his shoulder. "Sophia, my love, don't listen to them. Don't pay them any mind," he cried, his voice broken with anguish and love. His shout rose above the noise, but was drowned in the wave of cruelty. Sophia, who had already scrambled to her feet, looked around, completely lost, as if she had woken up in a nightmare. The faces staring at her were distorted by laughter and scorn. Her desperate attempt to help her father had become a humiliating spectacle, entertainment for a bored crowd. She tried to breathe, but the knot in her throat was so large and painful that no air could pass. Her eyes, once full of faith, now filled with tears of confusion and shame. Judge Vargas adjusted the glasses on his nose, a habitual gesture he used to reassert his authority and distance himself emotionally. He cleared his throat, demanding silence. "Let us have order in this court," he commanded, his steel-edged voice cutting through the air and silencing the last of the laughter. "This is a court of justice, not a playground. We have a sentence to deliver." His coldness had returned, thicker and heavier than ever, as if the incident had solidified him further. He picked up the sheet of paper containing the verdict, his hands perfectly steady. He took a deep breath, and in a firm, implacable voice, he declared the sentence that had been sealed from the beginning. After reviewing all evidence presented and dismissing the interruptions, this court finds the defendant, Javier Mendoza, guilty of all charges. He is therefore sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison. The gavel fell with a sharp final crack, a sound like a nail being hammered into the coffin of the Mendoza family's hope. The little girl could take no more. The moment the sound of the gavel struck the wood, something inside her broke. A choked sob became a cry of pure anguish. She turned and fled down the central aisle of the courtroom, pushing past those who stood in her way with her small arms, seeing nothing through the veil of tears that clouded her vision. The laughter pursued her like cruel echoes, like monsters nipping at her heels. "Where are you going, miracle worker?" an anonymous voice taunted. "Going to perform another miracle in the hallway?" Tears streamed down her face, leaving clean tracks in the dust and grime on her cheeks. She stumbled over her own feet, nearly falling, but the desire to escape that cage of cruelty was stronger. Javier screamed her name again, a desperate call from across the room, but he was restrained by the guards who were already pulling him to his feet to lead him away. The slam of the heavy wooden door closing behind Sophia's fleeing figure was a brutal, violent end. The final closing, not just of a case, but of a child's innocence. Judge Mateo Vargas watched the scene with a hardened, impassive face. He showed not a flicker of remorse or compassion, but inside, a strange pressure was building in his chest, as if an invisible hand were squeezing his heart. "It's better this way," he told himself, a silent justification to quiet the pang of guilt that threatened to surface. The law is the law. Sentiment has no weight on the gavel of justice. He repeated the mantras that had sustained him for years, the phrases that formed the bars of his own emotional prison. And yet, despite his iron self-discipline, something was wrong. The image of the girl running, her small body racked with sobs, had been seared into his retina like a branding iron. He had presided over countless trials, had seen the tears of the accused and their victims, but never before had he felt so profoundly disturbed, so strangely implicated in the pain he had caused. It was a new and terrifying feeling, one he did not know how to name or how to suppress. A few seconds passed as the guards led away. Javier Mendoza, who no longer struggled but walked like an automaton toward his fate. The murmuring in the courtroom continued as people discussed the unexpected drama, but Judge Vargas no longer heard them. He felt a faint nausea, an acidity rising in his throat. His hand went to his stomach, an involuntary gesture of unease. He shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable, as if the leather and padding had been stuffed with stones. And then he felt it. It was subtle at first, so faint he thought it was a product of his imagination, a hallucination brought on by the stress of the moment. A warmth, a delicate tingling, like thousands of tiny needles waking from a long slumber, began to spread through his right calf. It was a sensation he had not experienced in 15 long, silent years. His first reaction was absolute denial, a mental defense to shield himself from madness. It's not real. It's psychosomatic. It's a hallucination brought on by that girl's farce, he repeated, the thought a frantic loop inside his head. He tried to focus on the papers, on the next case on the docket, on anything that would distract him from this impossible feeling. But the tingling did not fade. On the contrary, it grew in intensity, creeping slowly up his leg, past his knee, spreading into his thigh. It was as if an ancient, powerful force were breathing life into dead nerves, as if a river, dry for a decade and a half, had begun to flow again. His hand, which had been steady on the verdict moments before, now trembled uncontrollably. He gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly he felt his nails might tear through the leather. The courtroom, with its murmurs and artificial lights, began to fade into the periphery of his awareness. His entire world had shrunk to this incredible sensation coursing through his right leg. The court was still chattering and chuckling, but he no longer heard a thing. He was deaf to the outside world, trapped in the cataclysm unfolding within his own body. The tingling morphed into an intense heat, then a burning, and finally a pulse. A real, rhythmic beat he felt deep within his muscles. A heartbeat. His legs had a pulse. His eyes shot wide open, panic and astonishment wrestling for control of his expression. He tried to conceal it, to maintain his mask of cold composure, but it was impossible. His breathing became ragged, shallow. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead and soaked the collar of his shirt. And then, without thinking, acting on an instinct he had believed long extinct, he shoved against the arms of the chair with tremendous force, pushing his body forward. His feet, which for 15 years had been useless appendages, planted themselves clumsily on the marble floor. The contact, the pressure, the solidity of the ground beneath his shoes. It was the most overwhelming sensation he had ever known. With a trembling effort that made every muscle in his torso and arms scream in protest, he rose, slowly at first, with agonizing slowness, his body shaking like a leaf in a storm. Then, gaining an impossible confidence, he straightened, higher and higher, until, to the astonishment of everyone, and to his own absolute shock, he was fully standing. Standing, supported only by his own two legs. The room fell silent. The silence was instantaneous and total, as if someone had switched off the sound of the universe. One by one, the whispers ceased, the laughter died in throats, and every head turned to behold the impossible sight. Judge Mateo Vargas, the man of stone, the prisoner of the wheelchair, was standing in the center of his dais, motionless, held up by an invisible miracle. No one breathed. No one moved. Reporters held their pens suspended in midair. Lawyers stared, their mouths agape. The entire world seemed to pause in that sacred, terrifying instant. For 5 seconds, which felt like 5 centuries, Mateo Vargas was a whole man again. He felt his own weight distributed on his legs, the tension in his knees, the strength in his thighs. He looked down and saw his own shoes planted firmly on the floor. A vision as miraculous as seeing the sun rise in the west. The power, the normality, the freedom of that simple act of standing flooded him with a euphoria so intense it was almost painful. But then, as quickly as it had come, the strength began to falter. It was as if a castle built on sand had begun to crumble from within. A sudden weakness, a sense of emptiness, seized his legs. They gave way without warning, as if the strings holding them up had been severed by unseen shears. With a choked cry of surprise and despair, he fell heavily backward, collapsing gracelessly into the wheelchair that awaited him like an open grave. The thud of his body against the seat echoed in the absolute silence of the room, a dull and terrible sound. The impact knocked the wind out of him. The pain in his back was sharp, but it paled in comparison to the pain of shattered hope. He tried to push himself up again, with the same fury, the same desperation. But now everything was as it had been before. His legs were numb, cold, motionless. They were once again pieces of inert flesh, alien to his will. He stared down at them with a mixture of fear and betrayal, as if they were strangers who had promised him heaven only to cast him into hell. I was standing. I felt it, he murmured to himself, his voice a thread of disbelief, unable to find logic in what had just happened. The crowd did not know what to say, what to think. The scorn and mockery had vanished completely, replaced by a haunting, awestruck silence, as if they had all witnessed something that defied rational explanation, something that did not belong in this world of laws and logic. The judge's eyes, now wide and filled with an emotion no one had ever seen in them, frantically searched for the door through which Sofía had fled. The image of the girl running away in tears superimposed itself on the miraculous sensation he had just experienced. Her words echoed in his head with thunderous clarity, but this time they did not sound like a fantasy, but a prophecy. Just a little, enough for you to understand. It was just a test, he remembered, his own voice trembling as he formed the thought. For the first time in 15 years, for the first time since he had donned his robes, Judge Mateo Vargas had no certainty. He was facing something beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond everything he had ever learned and defended. He was facing something that, in all his rigor and arrogance, he had completely forgotten existed: faith. And though he was still sitting, though the control of his legs had vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone: that girl, that small, humiliated child, had told the truth. The next day dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself were undecided, mirroring Judge Vargas's tumultuous state of mind. Inside the official car that carried him, he did not look at the files for the next case. He watched the city streets slide slowly by the window, but he didn't truly see them. His mind was trapped in a loop, replaying those 5 seconds of glory and the devastating fall that followed. His hands, normally firm and steady, trembled slightly as they gripped the arms of his wheelchair. Since the episode in the courtroom, he could think of nothing else. Those 5 seconds of standing had stripped him of all his arrogance, all his certainties, everything he believed to be immutable. To feel his legs again, to feel life coursing through them, only to lose them again an instant later, had been a form of torture far crueler than the original accident. It was like being cast back into the deepest darkness after having glimpsed the sunlight for a single, brilliant moment. But what resonated most deeply within him, the question that tormented him, the one he desperately tried to avoid, was why? Why had it lasted for so short a time? If it was a hallucination, why did it feel so real? If it was a miracle, why was it so cruelly brief? The answer seemed inextricably linked to the girl and her promise. Just a test. The words swirled in his head. A test of what? He wondered. A test of faith? A test of her power? Or was it something more? The idea began to form in his mind. An idea as illogical and terrifying as what had happened. Perhaps the brevity of the miracle was connected to his verdict. Perhaps the strength that had lifted him had withdrawn the moment his gavel had sentenced an innocent man. It was madness, a superstition unworthy of a man of his intellect. But after what he had felt, he was no longer sure of anything. He had to find that girl. It wasn't an option. It was a necessity. The only way to find an answer, and perhaps to reclaim what he had been shown. After a few discreet but insistent calls, he found out where Sofía was. She had been taken to a city children's shelter, a grim, overcrowded place on the outskirts. When his car pulled up in front of the faded brick building, he was met with looks of mistrust and suspicion from the caregivers and the other children. A judge in a place like this almost always meant trouble. Custody revoked. Sentences, bad news. But that morning, Judge Mateo Vargas did not look threatening. There was something different in his gaze, a new weight, a vulnerability that belied his reputation. They led him in silence through noisy, disinfectant-scented hallways to a concrete backyard. And there she was. Sofía was sitting alone under the shade of a scrawny tree, tearing tiny pieces from a dry leaf and letting them fly away on the wind. She was lost in her own world of sadness, oblivious to the arrival of the man who had destroyed her family. The judge stopped his wheelchair a few feet from her. The squeak of the wheels on the concrete made her look up. Seeing him, she did not react with fear or anger. Her face remained expressionless, but her eyes, once bright, were now dull and empty. She kept her gaze on the ground, refusing to acknowledge his presence. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and the humiliation of the previous day. Mateo Vargas, the man who commanded words and wielded them as weapons, suddenly found himself at a loss. How do you begin a conversation with the child you publicly humiliated, whose father you sent to prison unjustly, and then ask her to explain a miracle? Sofía, he said finally, his voice lower and raspier than he would have liked. I need to talk to you. She raised her eyes slowly, fixing them on him, but said nothing. She simply waited, forcing him, the powerful judge, to be the one to plead. Mateo swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. The role reversal was unnerving. Yesterday, he began, hesitating for a moment. Yesterday in court, after you left, something happened. He paused, searching for the right words. For a few seconds, I stood. He said it in a whisper, as if confessing a crime. Sofía nodded slowly, showing not the slightest surprise, as if it were the most obvious news in the world. Her calm completely disarmed him. But then, I lost it, the judge continued, his voice now tinged with a desperation he could no longer hide. He looked down at his hands, which were visibly trembling. It was as if it was torn away from me. You said it was a test. But why? Why did it only last for 5 seconds? The question hung in the air, a naked plea that left him completely vulnerable before her. He, the judge, was asking a 7-year-old girl for answers. Sofía pressed her lips together, as if weighing whether he deserved the truth. She took a deep breath and finally answered with a firmness that was both childish and ancient. Why didn't you do what was right? She said, her words simple but sharp as glass. Faith can't hold up a man who commits an injustice. God would never keep a man standing who turns his back on the truth. The answer was so direct, so theologically simple, and yet so profoundly complex that it took Judge Vargas's breath away. His eyes widened, stung by the implicit accusation. Injustice, he repeated, his wounded pride coloring his voice with offense. I committed no injustice. I followed the evidence. I applied the letter of the law. I did exactly what I am supposed to do. His defense sounded weak, even to his own ears. The excuses of a bureaucrat facing an inescapable moral truth. The girl stood up and walked slowly toward him, stopping right beside his wheelchair. She looked him directly in the eyes, without fear, without intimidation. You followed the law of paper, she said, her voice soft but filled with a wisdom that did not belong to her age. Not the law of the heart, the law that knows the difference between what seems and what is. The judge frowned, confused. What do you mean by that? What are you talking about? Then, Sofía reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled something out. It was a small USB drive. a modern technological object that seemed out of place in her childish hands. It was wrapped with a piece of pink adhesive tape decorated with unicorns. She held the object out to the judge. This was hidden in a drawer. My papa put it there. The police never wanted to see it. They said it didn't matter. Judge Vargas took the small device with trembling hands, feeling the cheap plastic and the childish tape beneath his fingers. It was such a small object, and yet it felt immensely heavy, charged with a potential that terrified him. "What is this?" he asked, though a part of him already knew. "My dad installed a small camera in our living room a few months ago, after the house next door was robbed," Sofía explained, her voice now a torrent of contained information. "That night, the night of the pharmacy robbery, I was very sick. I had a high fever. He stayed home to take care of me. The camera recorded everything." The judge's heart began to pound. "Does it have audio?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sophie nodded vehemently. "Yes, you can hear me coughing all night. You can hear my dad call his boss to say he can't go to work the next day because he has to stay with me. You can hear him singing to me to help me sleep. He couldn't have robbed that pharmacy. He was home. He was with me." The judge took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely, as if something inside him, a master beam holding up his entire structure of certainty, had silently shattered. "No one, no one saw this?" he murmured, more a statement than a question. Sophia shook her head, her eyes filling with tears as she recalled the frustration. "We tried to give it to the officer who arrested him, Officer Nunez, but he wouldn't even look at it. He tossed it aside and said it was junk. He told us to stop making up stories. The public defenders didn't care about it either." For several seconds, the judge remained in absolute silence, staring at the small, pink plastic object resting in the palm of his hand. There, in that simple, cheap thing, was not only Javier Mendoza's innocence, it was the irrefutable proof of his own monumental failure. The line separating his terrible mistake from the possibility of redemption was right there, within his grasp. "You were right," he murmured at last, not daring to look at the girl. Shame was a leaden cloak upon his shoulders. He had humiliated this child, mocked her faith, and she had held the truth all along. Sophia sat on the concrete floor beside him, hugging her knees. "It's not about being right, Your Honor," she said, her voice soft again, almost a whisper. "It's about doing what's right." The same words she had said to him in the courtroom, but now they resonated with 1,000 times more weight. The judge closed his eyes. The image of Javier Mendoza's desperate face seared onto the inside of his eyelids. "What if it's too late?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt and fear. Sophia answered without the slightest hesitation, with a certainty that was both simple and profound. "My grandmother always said that it's never too late to do the right thing. It's just harder." The judge looked at her then, with a mixture of awe, respect, and a deep humility he had never felt before. This girl, this small figure in a faded dress and an ancient wisdom, was tearing down, one by one, all the walls he had built inside himself. She was teaching him about justice in a way no law school ever could. "I'm going to reopen the case," he said finally, his voice finding a new resolve. It felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right decision. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Sofía looked at him, her serious eyes sizing him up. What can I do? I'm just a little girl. He managed a faint smile, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in years. You can be my eyes and my ears, but more importantly, you can be my conscience. I need you to remind me why we're doing this, especially when things get tough. And I promise you, they will get very, very tough. The proposal sounded absurd, yet in that moment, it made more sense than anything he had done in the last 15 years. Sofía hesitated for an instant, trusting the man who had sent her father to prison was an enormous leap of faith. But there was something in his eyes, a broken, desperate sincerity that convinced her. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll help you. But only if you promise me one thing. The judge looked at her, expectant. What is it? That no matter what happens, you won't give up. Not until my dad is home. The request was simple, direct, and heavy with all of a daughter's love. Judge Vargas felt a lump form in his throat. He extended his hand, a hand that had signed guilty verdicts, and offered it to her. I promise, Sofía, I won't give up. The girl took his hand. Her small grip was firm and warm. They shook on it like two unlikely partners. A wheelchair-bound judge, scarred by bitterness, and a little girl in a faded floral dress, bound by an unshakable faith. Two lives that should never have crossed, now united by a common cause. As they left the shelter, while the driver helped him back into his car, Judge Vargas felt something. A faint pinprick in his left leg, an almost imperceptible echo of the tingling from the day before. It was weak, fleeting, but it was real. It was a sign, a silent promise that perhaps, if he followed this new, terrifying path, healing might be possible, not just for Javier Mendoza, but for him as well. He looked at Sofía, who walked beside him with short but determined steps, clinging to the car door as if she feared he might disappear. The gloomy shelter was behind them, and stretching out before them was a battlefield, a case to reopen, a monumental injustice to undo, and maybe, just a maybe, a miracle that was not yet finished. What had begun as an act of blind faith would now continue with the search for concrete evidence. But within both of them, something new and powerful had been born, an alliance forged in desperation and hope. The judge's chambers, once a sanctuary of cold order and implacable logic, transformed into a chaotic hub of investigation. The mahogany desk, normally immaculate, was now buried under stacks of paper, crime scene photos, interrogation transcripts, and black and white printouts. At the center of it all, connected to an old laptop the judge had rescued from a closet, was the pink USB drive. The recording it contained played on a loop on the screen. The image was homemade, slightly grainy, but clear. It showed Javier Mendoza in the small living room of his house, making soup in the kitchen, placing cool cloths on the forehead of a feverish Sofía, who coughed on the sofa and murmuring words of comfort. Easy, my little one. You'll see. You'll feel better tomorrow. Daddy's not going anywhere. The time and date stamp in the bottom corner of the screen was an irrefutable alibi, one that completely shattered the prosecution's case. With each replay of the video, the tension in Judge Vargas's shoulders seemed to lessen slightly, only to be replaced by a cold, rising anger. His focus was no longer just legal, a dispassionate analysis of facts. Now, there was something more, an emotional turmoil, a personal fury against the very system he represented, which had allowed such crucial evidence to be ignored. How was it possible? Was it simple negligence or something more sinister? Sofía, sitting beside him on a high chair so she could reach the table, watched everything in silence. She didn't ask about the legal procedures she didn't understand. She simply observed the judge, studying his face, his reactions. But when Mateo sighed for the fifth time in less than a minute, a deep, frustrated sigh, she dared to break the silence. Were you always this serious? She asked, with the brutal innocence of children who understand nothing of tact or diplomacy. The judge looked up from the screen, surprised by the personal question. What do you mean? He asked, not quite understanding. Sofía shrugged, swinging her feet, which didn't reach the floor. I don't know. It seems like you were born old, like you were never a kid. The statement was delivered without malice, with the cruel naturalness of a child who simply says what she sees. Mateo Vargas blinked twice, processing the observation, and then, to his own astonishment and the girls, he let out a laugh. It wasn't the dry, bitter laugh of the courtroom. It was a low, genuine chuckle, a rusty sound, long out of use, that caught him completely by surprise. Sophia's eyes widened, as if she had just seen a dog speak. What? She asked, amazed. You know how to laugh? He felt strangely exposed by that simple laugh. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Sometimes, he admitted, almost grudgingly, but not usually during work hours. Sofía gave him a mischievous grin, seeing the first crack in the judge's fortress. Well, then we're also working on making you smile more. You know, it's part of the deal. During the long afternoon hours, between reviewing dusty files and reading jargon-filled police reports, she would interrupt him with unexpected questions that had nothing to do with the case. Did you ever have a dog? Yes. One named Rayo, when I was a boy. What was your favorite food? My mother's lasagna. Did you like to run when you could? With each question, with each small provocation, an internal wall within Mateo crumbled, brick by brick. He tried to maintain his composure, the seriousness of his office, but his eyes began to soften, and every now and then, a smile, involuntary but sincere, would escape his lips like a prisoner tasting freedom for the first time. Sofía, cunningly, would pretend to jot notes in an invisible notebook each time he smiled. Another point for Team Joy, she would say quietly, but just loud enough for him to hear. It was a silent, one-sided war against his years of self-imposed rigidity, and she, with her arsenal of innocent questions and disarming smiles, was winning without raising her voice. At one point, as the judge rubbed his tired eyes, she pointed to an old photograph hanging on his office wall. It was an official portrait, taken shortly after he was appointed judge. In the photo, a younger Mateo Vargas, still standing, looked at the camera with an expression of pride and ambition. The black robe was immaculate, a bright future before him. You look happy there, Sofía commented. The judge stared at the image for a long moment before answering, his voice tinged with a melancholy he rarely let show. I wasn't happy. I was busy and proud. I thought that was happiness. The girl tilted her head, processing his words. But that's not the same as being really happy, is it? The question, so simple and so profound, struck him deeper than he wanted to admit. He remained silent, his gaze lost in his own past, in the image of that man who thought he had everything and knew nothing. No, he finally admitted in a whisper. No, it wasn't. And then, without quite knowing why, spurred on by the girl's attentive, non-judgmental gaze, he began to talk. He told her about the accident, not the details of the crash, but the desolation that followed, the chronic pain that became his constant companion, the gradual withdrawal of friends who didn't know how to deal with his bitterness, and the coldness he adopted as armor to keep the world at a distance so no one could ever hurt him again. He spoke for nearly an hour, emptying years of loneliness and resentment before the one person who seemed capable of listening. Sophia listened with wide eyes, motionless, absorbing every word, every painful pause. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply gave him the gift of her complete attention. When he finally stopped, exhausted by the confession, she asked him another question that threw him off balance. And you think you got so serious and angry just because you couldn't walk anymore? Mateo thought about it. It was the explanation he had always given himself, the justification for his bitterness. But now, saying it out loud, it sounded incomplete. I think, he said slowly, discovering the truth as he spoke it. I think I stopped walking on the inside, too. I gave up. I decided that if my body was broken, my soul had to be broken too. Sophia moved a little closer, like someone giving a frightened bird space to land on their shoulder. Well, she said softly, then let's start walking again, but this time on the inside first. The feet will follow later. The judge let out another of those brief, almost awkward laughs that showed how unaccustomed he was to joy. But he didn't deny it. In fact, a part of him wanted more of these conversations, of these looks that didn't judge, that demanded nothing. It was as if each of the girl's sentences was a damp cloth, slowly wiping clean the dustiest, most forgotten corners of his soul. Between reviewing an affidavit and analyzing an expert report, Sophia was determined to interrupt with questions that had nothing to do with the case, pulling him out of the darkness of the sordid details. If you were an animal, what would you be? He would roll his eyes, feigning annoyance. A hawk, I suppose. Silent, observant, always above everything. She laughed heartily. No, I think you'd be an armadillo. You curl up in your shell whenever you're scared or something hurts you. Mateo looked at her, pretending to be offended. But then he had to laugh again. All right, you got me. Maybe an armadillo in a judge's robe. That room, once a cold and austere mausoleum dedicated to the law, was beginning to feel like something Mateo hadn't experienced in years. A place with life, with laughter, with a strange and warm feeling of home. And as much as he tried to convince himself that the only focus was Javier Mendoza's case, he knew something much deeper was happening. He was healing. His thoughts no longer spun on an axis of laws, penal codes, and precedents. He began to ask himself simple, almost forgotten questions. Questions the little girl had taught him how to form again. What was my favorite color as a child? What used to make me laugh out loud before this robe became my second skin? When was the last time I looked up at the stars? And it was all thanks to a 7-year-old girl who, instead of fearing the severe, legendary judge, chose to meet him with sincere questions and the courage to love, even after he had humiliated and hurt her. It happened at the end of one long, exhausting afternoon as they gathered papers and stacked them into neat folders. Sophia had remarked casually, as if discussing the weather, "You know what I think, Judge?" He glanced at her, expecting another of her disarming questions. "I think you're not getting better just because of the miracle of my promise. I think you're getting better because you're letting the good things back in. You opened a tiny little window, and now the sun is streaming through." Mateo didn't answer. He couldn't. The knot in his throat was too tight for words. He just looked at her for a few long seconds, a faint smile on his lips, his eyes shimmering with emotion. He felt a gratitude so immense it could not be contained in words. Something was fundamentally changing inside him. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a healing far deeper and more significant than the physical. A healing you couldn't see, but one you could feel in every unexpected laugh, in every recovered memory. It was being born right there, in the silence, in the strange alliance between a broken judge and a little girl with immense faith. The days that followed were filled with a feverish energy. The stacks of paper in the study grew taller, coffee grew cold in forgotten mugs, and hours of intense silence were broken by the unexpected conversations Sophia would start. They had become a surprisingly effective investigative team. While she, with a meticulousness beyond her years, organized documents by date and relevance, creating a color-coded system with her own crayons. He immersed himself in the expert analyses, the depositions, and the police reports, rereading every word with a new perspective. That of a man searching for the truth, not just a conviction. His trained eyes, now free from the veil of cynicism, scanned each line with a renewed precision. And it was there, between one page and the next of the original case file, in an almost insignificant footnote, that Mateo Vargas stopped cold. His breath caught in his lungs. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible, a clerical error most would have overlooked. The arrest report filed by Officer Ricardo Nunez, the policeman who had arrested Javier Mendoza and dismissed the USB drive, had a filing date that made no sense. It had been officially logged one day, before the forensics team had formally collected the evidence. Mateo sat motionless, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. This, this can't be, he murmured. He read it again, this time aloud, as if to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Officer Nunez describes the exact location of a shell casing and the type of shoe prints found at the crime scene with details that could only be known after the experts did their work. And this report was filed 24 hours before the forensic analysis was conducted. The implication was so monstrous, it took him a moment to fully grasp it. Sophia, who had been drawing a flow chart of the case on a large piece of poster board, approached with curiosity, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "What is it?" she asked, seeing the judge's pale face. "Does that mean he, the policeman, knew what they were going to find before they found it?" The judge nodded slowly, his gaze darkening with the revelation. "It means exactly that, Sophia. It means he either wrote about something that hadn't been officially verified, or this man has the power of divination, or someone is lying on a monumental scale." Someone didn't just ignore the proof of your father's innocence. They actively fabricated the evidence to make sure he would be found guilty. The tension in the air became palpable, electric. This was no longer a case of negligence, it was a deliberate conspiracy. The case had taken a dark and dangerous turn. They were no longer facing a simple judicial error, but an enemy who was willing to do anything to hide the truth. Driven by a new urgency, Mateo wheeled himself over to an old metal filing cabinet he hadn't opened in years. It contained his personal notes, parallel observations he had made throughout his career about the suspicious conduct of officers and lawyers, things he couldn't prove, but that his gut told him were wrong. He searched for the folder with the letter N, and there it was. Ricardo Nunez. His name was flagged in red ink in at least 3 internal incidents that had been conveniently archived and forgotten. One, for coercing witnesses in a drug case. Another, for the misplacement of key evidence in an assault case. And a third, even more serious, for a strong suspicion of planting false evidence to close a high-profile case. All the incidents had been buried under bureaucracy without any deep investigation. This man is more than just a bad cop, Mateo muttered, his voice laced with contempt. He's a wolf in uniform, and he's been hunting in my city for years, and I never saw it. A new detail emerged from the forgotten files, a connection that made Mateo's blood run cold. One of the cases in which Nunez had been internally investigated involved a small-time contractor who had refused to pay him a bribe to expedite some building permits. That contractor's name was Javier Mendoza. Nunez had a personal grudge against him. The pharmacy robbery wasn't a random mistake. It was revenge. Nunez had seized the opportunity to frame Javier, to destroy the life of the man who had dared to defy him. Mateo straightened in his chair. It was an instinctive movement, as if his body were responding to the outrage he felt. His legs still lacked strength, but a new kind of strength, a moral strength, surged through his entire being. That monster arranged everything, he said, his voice trembling with rage. He set the trap, and all of us, myself included, walked right into it, and no one wanted to see the signs. Sofía watched him in silence. She was seeing the transformation in real time. The judge was no longer speaking as a distant authority who had discovered a flaw in the system. He was speaking as a man waking up to a painful truth about himself and the world he thought he controlled. He was speaking as someone who realized that justice was not an abstract mechanism, but something fragile that had to be actively defended by people of conscience. We're going to need a reconsideration hearing immediately, Mateo declared, his voice now firm and resolute. Sofía, holding a large binder on her lap, looked at him, her eyes searching for the confirmation her heart needed. Does that mean you're going to change the sentence? That you're going to free my dad? He nodded, his gaze locked with hers, sealing his promise. If I can prove in court that there was procedural fraud and fabrication of evidence, I can and I will overturn that conviction. We're going to bring your father home, Sofía. That very day, without wasting a second, Judge Vargas drafted the formal request to reopen the case, a meticulously argued legal document that laid out the new evidence and the grave irregularities discovered. It was a legal bombshell, and he knew it. When he delivered the document personally to the clerk of the court, the silence that fell in his wake was different than usual, It wasn't respect, it was shock. The news spread through the courthouse corridors like wildfire. The judge, who had delivered one of the swiftest and harshest sentences in months, was now asking to nullify his own verdict based on the claims of a child and a pink flash drive. It was unheard of. Shortly after, as expected, he was summoned to the office of a veteran prosecutor, a powerful man named Alejandro Rivera, someone he had known since law school, an old friend turned political rival within the system. The prosecutor's office was deliberately dim, the blinds nearly closed, creating an atmosphere of interrogation. Alejandro Rivera stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the sliver of entering light. "Are you absolutely sure about what you're doing, Mateo?" Rivera asked, his voice dangerously calm, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Mateo, seated in his wheelchair before the imposing desk, did not hesitate. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Alejandro." The prosecutor turned slowly, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "Reopening a case with a final judgment, a conviction that was applauded by the press, based on the fragile claims of a 7-year-old girl and a video of dubious origin. It's professional suicide, and you know it. You're about to throw away a 30-year career." The threat wasn't veiled. It was a clear warning. "Stop now, or we will destroy you." Mateo didn't respond immediately. He simply held Rivera's gaze, letting the silence stretch. He knew this was more than just concern for his career. Rivera and Nunez were known to work together on many cases. Protecting Nunez meant protecting himself and the system that allowed them to operate with impunity. The prosecutor took a step forward, his voice now a low, threatening hiss. "Are you really going to throw away everything you've built for some stray kid who showed up out of nowhere, claiming she can make you walk with magic? Have you gone mad, Mateo? Has the pain finally broken your mind? People are saying you're losing your judgment, that you're an easy target for any manipulator." There was venom in every word. But beneath the venom, Mateo could detect something else. Fear. A deep-seated fear that he, with his strange new determination, might actually lift the rug and expose all the filth hidden beneath. "That stray kid, as you call her," Mateo replied, his voice firm and resonant, "has seen more truth in 1 week than you and I have in 30 years of wearing this robe. And you have no idea what I felt in that courtroom. You have no right to speak of it." The other man smirked, a sneer of contempt. "No, I don't know what you felt, but I do know this is going to cost you dearly. I will make you regret ever challenging the system." Mateo began to turn his wheelchair to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Rivera over his shoulder. "Then you'd better start preparing the bill, Alejandro, because I intend to pay it gladly. Some debts are an honor to settle." He left the office, leaving the prosecutor standing in his own shadows, stunned by the resolve of a man he thought he had broken long ago. In the car, on the way to the safe house he had rented for himself and Sofía, Mateo stared out the window, his face tense. Rivera's veiled threat still echoed in his ears. He knew it wasn't an empty boast. Rivera had power, connections. He could make his life a living hell. He could try to discredit him, paint him as a senile old fool. But there was something stronger beating in his chest, a counterweight to that fear. the memory. That moment, however brief, when his legs had responded, was still etched into his body, into his muscle memory. The girl's faith had left a sacred mark on his soul, a quiet but inextinguishable flame that now fueled his courage. He closed his eyes for an instant. This was no longer just about freeing Javier Mendoza. It was about fighting for all the Javier Mendozas who had been crushed by indifference and corruption. It was about himself, about proving that the man he had been for 15 years could be reborn from his own ashes. Sofía was waiting for him on the apartment building steps, sitting on the bottom one with a worn-out backpack on her lap, like a little sentry. When she saw the car arrive, she ran to the door, her face filled with hopeful anxiety. "Well?" she asked as soon as the driver opened the door for him. "Did we do it?" Mateo got out with the driver's help, and for the first time, he used a cane he had bought that morning, leaning on it with difficulty but with determination. He looked at the little girl and gave her a tired but victorious smile. "We're in, little partner. New hearing in 4 days." Sophia's face lit up with a smile so radiant it seemed to part the gray clouds in the sky. She jumped for joy, spinning in a little circle. "So now you're like a superhero with a tie, right? The wheelchair avenger? Well, now with a cane." The judge rolled his eyes, feigning annoyance. "Don't exaggerate, Sophia." But inside, something in him was smiling too. She put names to things he didn't know how to name, and slowly, his wounded heart was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be a hero after all. Night fell silently over the city, but inside the small rented house where Mateo and Sofia had taken refuge, something hung heavy in the air. It wasn't fear, but a sense of anticipation, the tense calm before a decisive battle. The curtains were drawn, muffling the street noise and isolating their small headquarters from the rest of the world. Warm lamps cast long shadows on the walls, making the modest living room feel like a stage set for a drama. Seated at the dining table, the judge reviewed the documents for the complaint he would file against Officer Nunez one last time, underlining inconsistencies and adding notes in the margins. Sophia, sitting on the floor, with several open folders spread around her, like the petals of a flower, read witness statements in a low voice, searching for any detail he might have missed. They had become a well-oiled machine, two minds working as one. The only constant sound in the house was the monotonous tick-tock of the kitchen clock. It was a sound that would normally go unnoticed, but tonight it seemed amplified, marking the passage of borrowed time. There was an unnatural silence, a stillness that felt wrong, as if danger itself were holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to knock on their door. And then it came, a snap, a sharp, dry crack from the back of the house, from the small patio. Mateo looked up from his papers, his senses suddenly on high alert. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia, who had been about to yawn, froze, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded silently. "It sounds like someone's back there," she said, her voice trembling. She rose slowly, moving with the stealth of a frightened animal, and tiptoed toward the window that overlooked the patio. But before she could even touch the curtain to peer outside, the back door was torn from its hinges with a brutal, violent crash. The wooden frame splintered into pieces, and the door slammed against the interior wall with devastating force. Time seemed to freeze in that instant of chaos. Mateo spun his wheelchair around, his heart hammering against his ribs, utterly defenseless. And then, in the dark void where the door had been, a figure appeared. It was Ricardo Nunez, but not the arrogant, polished officer from the reports. This was a monster. His gaze was feverish, his eyes bloodshot and wild. His face was slick with sweat, his clothes in disarray, and in his hand, held with a tremor of fury, was a gun. "The game's over, Judge," he hissed, his voice distorted by hatred and desperation. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. In that moment of pure terror, Mateo's survival instinct kicked in. He instinctively tried to back the chair away, but the wheels bumped clumsily against the table leg, trapping him. His trembling hands gripped the armrests, his only pathetic defense. He had nowhere to go. "Nunez, think about what you're doing," he said, trying to make his voice sound firm and authoritative. The judge's voice. But inside, his heart threatened to burst from his chest. He knew logic would be useless with a man in this state. The officer pointed the gun directly at him, his hand shaking, but his intention mortally clear. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Vargas," he snarled. "You should have accepted defeat like a good loser. But no, you had to play the hero, the savior of the innocent, all because of a meddling little brat." At that moment, his eyes found Sofía, and the rage in his gaze intensified. It was then that Sofía, who had been paralyzed by fear at the entrance to the living room, reacted. Her eyes met the judge's. She saw the pure terror on his face, then looked at the barrel of the gun aimed at him. And without thinking, without a shred of doubt, with an animalistic cry that tore from the depths of her being, she ran. She didn't run to hide. She ran straight into the danger. With the force of a small projectile, she threw the full weight of her body against Ricardo Nunez's legs. The impact caught him completely by surprise. The officer, who was focused on the judge, stumbled backward, losing his balance. The weapon, torn from his grasp by the collision, went flying, skittering across the tile floor and coming to a stop under the dining room table. Nunez and Sofía fell together in a tangle of limbs on the rug, and she began to scream and fight like a lioness defending her cub. She kicked, bit, and clawed. She was a tiny, desperate fury, a child fighting with every ounce of strength in her small body. "Don't touch him! Leave him alone!" she screamed between sobs of rage and fear. Mateo, terrified, shouted the girl's name. "Sofía, no! Get away!" But he could do nothing. He was trapped in that damned chair, watching the chaos and violence unfold before him, feeling the most overwhelming helplessness of his life. Nunez, enraged by the unexpected attack and the humiliation of being toppled by a child, recovered quickly. With a grunt of pure rage, he shoved Sofía with brutal force, sending her flying against the wall. The girl's small body hit the plaster with a sickening thud. She staggered, breathless, but miraculously stayed on her feet, her chest heaving, her defiant eyes fixed on him. The officer wasted no time. He scrambled across the floor, retrieved the gun, and aimed again. But this time, his target had changed. He now aimed at them both, the barrel of the gun shifting from the judge's head to the girl's, as if deciding who to destroy first. I swear on my life, this all ends here, he growled, cocking the gun with a metallic click, the most terrifying sound Mateo had ever heard. Time seemed suspended, each second stretching into an unbearable agony. And then, Sofía did something that broke the judge's heart into 1,000 pieces. Trembling from head to toe, she deliberately stood in front of Mateo's wheelchair, using her fragile, small body as a human shield. If you want to hurt him, she said, her voice ragged with fear, but unwavering in its resolve, you'll have to go through me first. The image was devastating. A helpless child protecting a powerful but crippled man from a monster with a gun. Death was standing right there, in the middle of their living room, enjoying their terror. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the life and death drama unfolding in that small house. No one seemed to hear the screams, the crash. They were alone. Nunez smiled, a twisted, demented grin. He seemed to enjoy the dilemma, his absolute power over their lives. He raised the weapon, aiming directly at Sophia's chest. Mateo closed his eyes, bracing for the sound of the shot, a sound he knew would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. And it was then, in that precise instant, in a miracle of perfect timing, that the deafening wail of police sirens shattered the silence like a clap of thunder from heaven. The red and blue lights of the patrol cars flooded the room through the window, painting the walls with intermittent flashes of panic and hope. Nunez whirled around, stunned, his face contorted with disbelief and fury. He hesitated for one fatal second, and in that second, the front door was also kicked in. Police! Drop the weapon now! Several officers shouted as they stormed the house, their own weapons drawn and aimed directly at Nunez. It was over. The predator had become the prey. Nunez froze, his fingers still on the trigger, his mind unable to process the sudden turn of events. He had no time to react, to negotiate, to fire. He was tackled by two burly officers who came down on him like a ton of bricks, subduing him on the floor with overwhelming force. The gun slid far from his reach, harmless now. As they cuffed him, Nunez kept cursing and struggling, his rage finally contained by the very laws he had sworn to protect and had so vilely betrayed. His escape was closed for good. They would later learn that an elderly neighbor, kept awake by insomnia, had seen a suspicious man jump the back fence and had called the police as a precaution. A patrol car had been nearby and had arrived in less than 3 minutes. Luck, or perhaps providence, had been on their side. Once Nunez was taken away, the adrenaline that had kept them standing vanished, giving way to shock and exhaustion. Mateo was breathing as if he had run a marathon, his heart still pounding at a frantic pace. Sofía, her bravery spent, collapsed to her knees, her small body finally succumbing to an uncontrollable tremor. A paramedic gently examined her, making sure she wasn't injured beyond the blow to her back. She already seemed calmer, though still pale and frightened. But as soon as the paramedic finished, she went to the judge's chair and squeezed his hand tightly. She said nothing, and neither did he. They just looked at each other. The judge's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and horror for what she had done. After several minutes of a silence that said everything, he finally murmured, his voice broken with emotion. "You saved my life, Sophia. You truly saved me." The girl looked at him, her own voice choked, and gave him a small smile. "And you? You believed in my dad when nobody else in the world did." Mateo squeezed her hand tighter, sealing a bond that went beyond words. "I will never again doubt you, or anything you tell me." She smiled, a little stronger this time, still catching her breath. "Then we're even." And there, amidst the splintered wood, the lingering tension, and the ragged breaths, something was born that is not written in legal codes or taught in law books. A profound alliance, forged in the fire of violence and loyalty, between a man wounded by life and a girl who refused to stop fighting for what she loved. The day of the new trial had arrived. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but the courtroom was already packed before 8. Lawyers with no connection to the case, journalists from every major news outlet, family members from both sides, and a crush of curious onlookers crowded the benches, all wanting to witness the return of the Mendoza case. But more than that, they all wanted to see Judge Mateo Vargas. That morning's headlines had treated the hearing like a circus act. The judge who walked for 5 seconds, miracle or manipulation. They speculated about his mental state, about the girl's influence, about a police conspiracy. But for those truly involved, this was far more than a sensational news story. This was justice, with a capital J waiting to be served after being brutally profaned. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of skepticism, anticipation, and an almost unbearable tension. Javier Mendoza arrived with his lawyers, a free man, but with the shadow of the prison still in his eyes. He looked around warily, as if expecting guards to slap handcuffs on him at any moment. At his side, never letting go of his hand, walked Sofía. But she was not the same frightened, humiliated girl who had fled this very room. Now she walked with her head held high, her light blue dress seeming more vibrant that morning, and on her face was a look of serene determination. When they entered, a hush fell over the room, and all eyes turned to them. But the true silence, the absolute silence, fell a few minutes later, when the side doors to the bench swung open. And there he was, Judge Mateo Vargas, standing, leaning lightly on a dark wooden cane, but standing. He wore his black robe like silent armor, his face impassive, but his eyes burning with a new intensity. Each step he took toward his chair was a challenge to expectations, a silent declaration. He did not walk perfectly. He limped noticeably, but he walked with a dignity and strength that left everyone breathless. When Mateo positioned himself before the bench and slowly sat in his chair, the murmurs ceased completely. Everyone in that room, from the prosecutor to the last journalist in the gallery, knew that something fundamentally different was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, his voice steady and clear, resonating with a renewed authority. "This hearing has been convened following the presentation of new and extraordinary evidence that not only questions, but pulverizes the conviction previously handed down against Mr. Javier Mendoza." There was no trace of emotion on his face, but anyone paying close attention could see something new in his eyes, a flame of unshakable certainty. The prosecution, represented by a nervous young deputy of Alejandro Rivera's, tried to contain the impact, arguing technicalities and procedures. But they were soon completely overwhelmed by the avalanche of evidence that the defense, guided by the judge's own notes, began to present in a methodical and devastating fashion. First, displayed on the large courtroom screens, was the USB drive. The images of Javier caring for his sick daughter, the date and time clearly visible to all, silenced any doubt about his alibi. The audio of his call to his boss, the child's cough, his lullabies, it all painted a picture of a devoted father, not an armed robber. Then came the evidence. Sofia's medical records, detailing her fever, the pharmacy receipts from the day before, proof that had been either omitted or ignored in the previous trial. But the final piece of evidence, the one that sealed the fate of the case and drew a collective gasp from the courtroom, was the detailed report and proof of the attempted assault on an officer of the court, Judge Vargas himself, and on a key witness, Sofía Mendoza. The attack had occurred just 2 nights earlier. The courtroom watched the police station videos of Núñez being arrested. They saw the medical reports on Sofia's minor bruises, the weapon found in the officer's possession, and the neighbor's testimony who had called the police. They saw photographs of the shattered door. It was a mountain of evidence so overwhelming it was suffocating. Ricardo Núñez, present in the courtroom, handcuffed and flanked by 2 guards, kept his face taut, his jaw clenched. He denied nothing. His silence was a confession in itself. The prosecutor, left with no arguments, his face pale with humiliation, was forced to offer a public apology to the defense and withdraw all charges. And then, Mateo Vargas, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment, lifted the printed sentence from the previous trial. In a symbolic gesture, he tore it in half. Before the irrefutable evidence of fabricated evidence, obstruction of justice, and the violent attempt to silence witnesses by the officer in charge of the original investigation, he declared, his voice ringing with newfound clarity, this court declares that Javier Mendoza is, and always has been, innocent of all accusations. His conviction is hereby annulled, effective immediately. He is a free man, the room erupted, not in laughter, but in applause, in shouts of joy, in a collective wave of relief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Sofía pressed her hands to her mouth, lost in a moment of joyous shock, before running to her father, who was already being freed from his final restraints. Javier swept her into his arms, lifting her into the air and spinning with her as tears streamed freely down his cheeks. You saved me, my love. You saved me all by yourself, he murmured into her hair, his voice choked with emotion. No, Papa, she said, her face buried in his neck, but her eyes looking over his shoulder toward the bench. He saved us too. Mateo watched the scene from a distance, a knot in his throat that kept him from speaking. He had done the right thing. He had rectified his mistake, but he felt that something was still missing. The circle was not yet closed. It was then that Sofía pulled away from her father's arms. Before the astonished gaze of the entire courtroom, she walked slowly toward him once more. The court fell silent again, a reverent hush this time. She stopped before the bench, just below him. May I? She asked, her voice soft, but her eyes shining with an intensity that pierced him. Mateo, not knowing exactly what she meant, but trusting her completely, nodded. The little girl knelt with the same reverence as the first time, as if before something sacred. Her small hands touched the judge's legs again, but this time with more firmness, more confidence. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak in a low voice, with an emotion that made the entire room hold its breath. I know it's hard to believe, she whispered, but if you believe in the truth now, if your heart is clean now, let God finish what he started. And then she began to weep silently as she whispered, not from sadness, but from a total surrender, a pure faith that poured from her like liquid light. Her words trembled in the air like invisible incense, filling every corner of the room. For everything you did to repair the damage, for defending what was right, no matter the cost. I ask that God now complete what is missing. I ask him to give you back what was taken from you. The girl's hands pressed gently on Mateo's knees, but there was an immense force in that contact, a current of energy he could feel clearly. She was trembling all over, but she didn't stop. Her voice rose slightly, filled with a spiritual authority that was overwhelming. You walked before because of a promise. Now I ask you to walk because of the truth. And this time, what happened was different. It was not the sudden, violent sensation of the first time. It was slow, deep, organic, like the thawing of a spring frost, like the dawn after the longest night. Mateo's legs began to tingle, but it was no longer that fleeting, superficial sensation. It was a deep warmth that began in the marrow of his bones, a current of life ascending slowly, awakening every nerve, every muscle fiber. It was as if something were reawakening inside him, reconnecting circuits that had been severed for 15 years. His toes, which had been motionless for an eternity, twitched. The muscles in his calves contracted, and then, without the support of his cane, without the help of his arms, with a fluidity and a firmness that defied all medical logic, he rose. He stood, tall and solid as an oak tree. There was no tremor, no hesitation. A murmur of astonishment swept through the room, followed by tears, sobs, and finally, a thunderous explosion of applause that shook the building. Sofía, still kneeling, opened her eyes and smiled through her tears. Mateo looked down at his own legs, moving them slightly, feeling their strength, their solidity. Then he looked at the child still kneeling at his feet. It was you, he murmured, his voice filled with a reverent awe. She answered with the simplicity of a saint, shaking her head. It was God. I just asked properly this time. The jury, the lawyers, the journalists, everyone was on their feet, applauding not just the innocence of a man, but the miracle they had just witnessed. Some clapped, others wept openly, but no one, absolutely no one, left that room the same person who had entered. In that court, where justice had so often been, just an empty name, and the law a cold tool, something much greater had manifested itself, not only in the healed body of the judge, but in the soul of everyone present. And at last, Mateo Vargas, the former man of stone, looked at the child with tear-filled eyes and said the only words that mattered. Justice was done, and for the first time in years, everyone agreed. The courthouse was behind them, literally and figuratively. Javier and Sofía walked out of the imposing stone building without handcuffs, without uniforms, without fear. They simply held hands, descending the wide steps in a shared silence that was more eloquent than any words. Outside, the sky, which had been gray and oppressive that morning, now seemed bluer, brighter, as if it too were breathing a sigh of relief after the tense drama. Some people leaving the trial applauded as they passed. Others gave them a thumbs up, but they said nothing, only smiling shyly. Their victory was too large, too intimate and personal to be contained in public words or gestures. They didn't stop to talk to the press that swirled around them. They went straight to a taxi to go home, to the small, humble house where all the pain had begun, and where now, at last, the healing could begin. During the ride, Javier couldn't stop looking at his daughter, who had snuggled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. He was still trying to understand how, amid so much injustice, among so many walls of power and corruption, his little girl had managed to move mountains with the sole force of her faith and her love. It was a mystery he would probably never fully comprehend. Sofía, for her part, didn't want to talk about miracles or trials. She just wanted to sleep in her father's lap, to feel his scent, the beat of his heart, the security of his presence. And so she did. She fell into a deep sleep before they even reached home, and they slept like that, curled up together on the sofa in their small living room, as if the entire world, with all its noise and fury, had shrunk to the size of that embrace, the only safe place they knew. A few days passed. Routine, that blessed healing routine, slowly returned to their lives. Javier dedicated himself to fixing the little things around the house that had broken during his absence. A squeaky hinge, a loose tile in the kitchen, the clothes hanging on the line in the yard. Each mundane task was a silent celebration of his freedom. Sofía, meanwhile, spent hours drawing on the living room floor, covering sheets of paper with colorful crayons. One day, Javier saw what she was drawing. It was the image of a tall man in a black robe and a cane, and beside him, a little girl in a blue dress. But the most surprising thing was that the man in the robe was smiling, a wide, genuine smile. Beneath the drawing, in her clumsy, childish handwriting, Sofía had written a title, The Judge Who Walked and Smiled. They weren't expecting visitors. They had isolated themselves from the world. They needed time for themselves. So when one afternoon, the squeak of the metal gate opening was heard, they both looked at each other in silence, a pang of anxiety between them. And there he was, Mateo Vargas, not the judge, but the man. He wasn't wearing a robe or a suit, but a light gray jacket and simple trousers. And in his hands, he held a bouquet of flowers, daisies, large and white. Sofía's late mother's favorite, a detail he had discovered while reviewing Javier's personal documents during the case investigation. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. It showed that he had cared, that he had looked beyond the case files. Javier walked slowly to the gate, his steps measured, unsure how to react. The two men, the one who had condemned and the one who had been condemned, looked at each other for long seconds, with no robe between them, no gavel, no distance of a bench. Just two men, two fathers in their own way, marked by battles both different and profound. Mateo extended the bouquet. "It's not much, but it's what I could find," he said, his voice strangely shy. Javier took the flowers, holding them with an almost reverent care. Then he breathed in deeply, the scent of daisies filling his lungs, a scent that transported him to happier times. Mateo looked him directly in the eyes, and with a voice broken by emotion but firm in its purpose, he said the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head, but which now came straight from his broken and rebuilding soul. "Javier, forgive me. I failed you, as a judge and as a man. I condemned you when my duty was to protect you. I let the darkness win, because it was easier than searching for the light. There are no excuses for what I did, and I will live with that shame for the rest of my days. I am so sorry." For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the song of a bird in a nearby tree. Javier didn't hesitate. There was no resentment in his gaze. There was no bitterness in his heart. He pressed the flowers to his chest, took a deep breath, and replied with a serenity and grace that completely disarmed the judge. "You came back. You fought. That's what matters. I forgive you, truly, with a clean heart." Those words, spoken with such humility, washed away what remained of the pain in Mateo's eyes. And then, something that had seemed impossible happened. Awkwardly, the two men embraced. Without words, just the gesture, a silence that wasn't heavy, but liberating. Sofía, who had been spying on the scene from the doorway, her eyes bright and expectant, could hold back no longer. When she saw the two men separate, she ran to them and wrapped her small arms around the judge's waist. "I thought you weren't coming to see us anymore," she said, her voice muffled against the fabric of his jacket. Mateo smiled, a trembling, tear-filled smile as he stroked her head. "I took so long because I didn't know how to thank you. How do you thank someone who has given you your life back?" The little girl pulled back slightly and pointed toward the house. "Do you want to come in? Papa is making hot chocolate." He hesitated for a second, feeling like an intruder in this sacred space he had come so close to destroying. Then he nodded. "Please, I'd love that." And so, the three of them went inside, together, into the small house, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. As if this moment wasn't the end of a story of pain, but the true beginning of a new one. A story of an unlikely family forged in faith, forgiveness, and redemption. In the small backyard, the afternoon sun painted everything in a warm golden hue. A light breeze whispered through the leaves of the single tree. Sofía, excited by their guest, turned on an old radio, the kind that only picked up 2 or 3 stations, and always with a little static. A slow song began to play, a ballad that was a little cheesy but beautiful. The girl looked at the judge with a mischievous, challenging smile. "Well, Mr. Judge, if you can walk now, I suppose you can dance too, right?" Mateo laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that surprised even Javier, who was watching them from the kitchen doorway with a cup of hot chocolate in his hands. "Oh, let's not get carried away, Sofía. It's one thing to walk, another thing entirely to dance. I might break something." But she insisted, holding out her small hand as if she were a lady in a grand ballroom. An invitation both solemn and undeniable. "Just once. I promise not to step on you too hard." Javier watched from a distance, his arms crossed, a quiet but immensely happy smile on his face. And Mateo, the man who had never danced, not even when he could, the man of stone, the armadillo in a judge's robe, looked at the little girl's outstretched hand, at Javier's encouraging smile, and for the first time in his life, he accepted. With clumsy steps, a slight tremor in his knees, born not of weakness, but of pure nerves, Mateo took Sofia's small hand and spun with her in the middle of the concrete courtyard. Their dance was more a stumble than a waltz, more laughter than rhythm. But the joy was so real, so pure, it seemed to illuminate the entire space. With every turn, with every peal of Sophia's laughter, with every instruction she gave, no judge, the other foot, something that had shattered within them, within all three of them, began to piece itself back together. It was mended, piece by piece, with a glue made of music, sunshine, and hot chocolate. Sofia spun with a lightness and grace that seemed innate, as if she had been born to dance, born to greet the world with her joy. And Mateo, despite his stiffness, his awkwardness, let himself be led by her. He allowed himself to be vulnerable. He allowed himself to be happy. The judge, who was once made of stone, now seemed to float on the golden afternoon air. The song ended, but they kept going, turning slowly in the silence, swayed only by the sound of their own laughter. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The radio crackled softly in a corner, forgotten, and in that perfect moment, there were no sentences, no illnesses, no corrupt prosecutors, no wheelchairs. There was only a girl, a father, and a man who had been saved by them both. This was no longer about justice. It was about healing, about a new beginning, about grace in its purest form. Mateo finally stopped, breathing lightly, with tears in his eyes that he no longer bothered to hide. He looked at Javier, then at Sofia. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The little girl came closer and took both of his hands in hers. "You just needed a little push," she said, and he laughed. For the first time, he laughed loud and free, a true, genuine laugh. And so, amidst laughter and clumsy steps, this story came to a close. A story that was never just about laws, but about faith, about second chances, and about the incredible power of a child to teach a man how to walk, how to forgive, and how to live again.